Hello everybody, welcome to episode 57 of Life and Life Only. This is an episode I've been thinking about doing for a few weeks, but I was putting it off, but now I decided to get some notes together and get it done and out there. If you're new to this podcast, it's usually dealing with inner truth, which is to do with self-development, and then outer truth, which is often to do with media, sometimes conspiracies, about how we receive the world. This episode, I suppose, would be called a true crime one. And I did do a couple of episodes way back in the early days of the podcast, episodes 9 and 10, on the famous Rillington Place murder case, which happened in the 1940s and 50s in London. What I'm going to cover today is much more current than that. I'm going to be focusing mostly on Axel Rudakubana and the Southport attacks, but I will also be mentioning Lucy Letby as well. I tend not to make videos about current things, or I don't do them right in the moment, because I prefer to wait a bit and let my immediate reactions to things pass. Now, the cases of Axel Rudakubana and Lucy Letby, they do have one major similarity, which is the apparent murders, and I'm saying apparent in Lucy Letby's case, in view of the way that public opinion about that and the evidence is moving. Obviously, in the other case, it was clearly murders, but they both involved murders of babies and children. Both happened in the north of England, which is not particularly significant. One was tried at Liverpool and the other at Manchester. But of course, the manner of death was very different, as was the amount of direct evidence or lack of direct evidence. Now, in the case of Axel Rudakubana, this video might be slightly different from other videos I've seen in that I'm not going to be expressing hatred for him and saying things like, I hope this monster rots in hell or rots in jail. He is going to rot in jail. I'll get to that later on. At the same time, I won't be expressing sympathy, but I will be trying to understand, if that is at all possible, and to give you just a few observations from following the case and some of the material on it, videos and so forth that have appeared online. Now, some of you may know I do a podcast about John Lennon called Glass Onion, and I have done a couple of episodes about his killer, Mark Chapman, who is another absolutely reviled killer. And in that case as well, I was trying to understand what led him to do that. I think there's enough hatred going around. I'm just going to treat Axel Rudakubana as a human being, and I don't think that's offensive to the families, trying to understand. I won't be excusing or in any way glorifying his crime, which is absolutely horrific. I will unfortunately be giving you a couple of the precise details of it, but I'll explain why I'm doing that. At the same time, he was an innocent person once upon a time. He was a child. Seems that up to about the age of 12, which was roughly 6 years before he did this crime, he was, let's say, harmless. I don't know if he was normal or not. He was diagnosed with autism a few years ago. Now, I obviously knew about the Southport case. It actually happened at the end of July last year, and the aftermath of it, which I'll get to. But I didn't really read much into it. Sometimes you just get weighed down by just all the bad news and horrific events that are happening all around the world. I think the thing that sparked my interest actually was just reading some of the profile of him. And then it mentioned that he'd been in a BBC Children in Need appeal dressed as Doctor Who. And then I found the video on YouTube. It's still there, in fact, and I'll put it in the show notes. And just seeing this incredibly normal looking, on the surface, 11-year-old and thinking, what the hell happened to this guy? What I'm going to do is I'll just give you a little bit of the biography. This is not going to be an exhaustive podcast on the case because I'm more interested in the psychological aspects. And like I say, just adding a few things that I've observed or thought about this. He was born in 2006 in Cardiff. His parents are Christians, originally from Rwanda, and they moved to the UK in 2002. So Rudakubana is a British citizen. He's got an older brother who I believe is disabled. They lived in Cardiff and then moved to Southport in 2013. They settled in a village called Banks. And if you see the house and the area where they lived in, it looks extremely normal. Neighbours describe Rudakubana as quiet and unassuming, some saying they very rarely saw him. Some others said that he was very He was one of those kids who clung to his mother a lot. He's probably quite shy, probably quite quiet. Sometimes quiet kids are concealing something like rage. Of course, that's not always the case. I'm just making very much a generalisation. But I have known people. There was a kid at my school, and he didn't do anything as bad as this, but he was very quiet and very intense. And one day, someone just pushed him too far, and he punched them a couple of times and just went into sort of temporary frenzy. And he was restrained by the teacher. Luckily, actually, the teacher in the class at the time was a rugby teacher. He was a big guy. Anyway, so Rudakubana was involved in acting and drama, part of a musical theatre group. And then, as I mentioned, he was in this BBC Children in Need video. He attended Range High School in Formby, which is near Liverpool, from 2017. He first became known to officials in 2019, initially due to anxiety and social isolation, but then due to increasing concerns over his behaviour. On 4th of October 2019, aged 13, he contacted Childline and asked, "What should I do if I want to kill somebody?" In the following days, explained he wanted to kill someone who was bullying him at school. Now, let me just talk very briefly about bullying. It's not an excuse, okay? And autism is not an excuse as well. But I was bullied when I was at primary school. I basically moved to a new school, and my biggest crime was moving halfway through the school year. I moved in January. Obviously, the school year starts in September. And for no reason at all, really, apart from that, I was bullied. And it wasn't so much violence, but I just always felt that there were just 3 or 4 kids, and and one of them did bully me physically a little bit. Nothing severe, but bullying is horrendous. And it happens, of course, between adults in the workplace, for example. And it was a bit of a nightmare. In my case, the main bully, he actually was leaving our school before the age that you'd normally leave it. So maybe a year before the primary school actually ended. And on the last day he was here, I just plucked up my courage and I just went up to him and I just punched him in the face. And it's about one of about 3 punches that I've ever thrown in my life, outside of a boxing gym anyway. This is not comparable, but I'm just saying that the feeling of exhilaration and satisfaction, I can remember it now, that coursed through my body was quite overpowering. So the need to take revenge, or the feeling when you do take revenge, is quite strong. So I'm just offering that as some small insight into what a person's motivation might be. He was visited by the police shortly after the Childline incident. Rudakubana had been temporarily excluded from school, and he was expelled after he disclosed that he had taken a knife to school on about 10 occasions. From October 2019, Rudakubana attended the Acorn School in Ormskirk, I think that's in a similar area, a specialist education centre. During his admission meeting, Rudakubana was asked why he'd taken a knife into his previous school, to which he replied, to use it. In November, he was referred to the Anti-Extremism Prevent Scheme for researching school shootings during an IT class, the first of what would eventually be 3 referrals over the following 18 months. On 11th of December 2019, Rudakubana booked a taxi to take him back to Range High, where he threatened pupils and teachers with a hockey stick on which he had written their names. Now again, this is another thing that you might find. I have heard of this before, that when someone takes revenge on a bully, they might write their name. I mean, you see this in war, that people write things on bombs before they're sent. He struck one pupil with a hockey stick, breaking their wrist. Now, I don't know if that was the person who'd been bullying him or if he just wanted to get somebody. There was a video, another very grainy video of about 10 seconds. There's lots of videos related to Axel Rudakubana. I'll get to the other ones later, but it's strange how much video there is, in fact. And there's a video of him being restrained by, I guess it's a teacher and a couple of his classmates. And apparently some of his classmates called acts of violence doing an Axel. When the police arrived at the school, a knife was found in Rudakubana's backpack. In February 2020, he was charged with and pleaded guilty to assault occasioning actual bodily harm, possession of an offensive weapon, and possession of a bladed article, obviously a knife. A referral order was imposed. Following this incident, the Acorn School, that was the specialist education centre, refused to have Rudakubana on their premises and instead sent him schoolwork to complete at home, which he failed to do. He returned to school in July 2020. So you've also got COVID to factor in here. Maybe the isolation of COVID may have just exacerbated what was already going on. Anyway, he returned to school in July under a 2-to-1 supervision, but stopped attending again in May 2021 following reports of incidents at home. As I've already mentioned, he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. He was referred to Prevent twice more in early 2021. Police were involved with Rudakubana multiple times over the following year due to various incidents. In November 2021, he kicked his father and damaged his car in an argument. In March 2022, his mother reported him missing before a bus driver called the police on him for failing to pay his fare. And again in May 2022 in an argument where Rudakubana was denied access to his computer. From September, he was enrolled for sixth form at Pressfield High School and Specialist College in Churchtown, mostly via home visits by staff who were sometimes accompanied by the police. Now, what we now know is that he developed an obsession with violence, and there's various things that he was apparently Googling or perhaps saving images on his computer. Rwandan genocide, which obviously his family had been involved in. And I say involved, again, you get stories. Some say his father was some sort of warlord, and others say that they were victims of the genocide. Hitler, Genghis Khan, the Mau Mau rebellion, clan cleansing in Somalia, punishment against slaves, and then various wars, Gaza, Israel, Korean War, Iraq War. Now, a lot of attention was given to the fact that he had or downloaded an Al-Qaeda manual. That may or may not be significant. Obviously, Al-Qaeda is a famous terrorist group in terms of how the West view them. Of course, a lot of talk after the Southport attack was about terrorism. And I think the judge, when he was sentencing him, said that he didn't consider it a terrorist attack. It entirely depends how you define terrorism. Did he cause terror? Obviously. Absolutely. Was it for a cause? I would say almost certainly no. I think it was driven by an extreme rage, probably some nihilism and a deep disturbance in the brain. And I did a 3-parter on emotional intelligence, episodes 11 to 13, based on the Daniel Goleman book. And I don't know if it was in that book or some other research that I did, but they said that this kind of mental disturbance, it happens because of, it's like a switch in the functioning of the brain. It's almost like flicking a switch. And unless it's treated intensely, it's very difficult to flick that switch back off, if you know what I mean. So if we go forward to 22nd of July 2024, 1 week before the Southport attack, Rudakubana used a pseudonym to book a taxi to take him to Range High School. That was the original school he was at, where he'd been bullied, minutes before the school broke up for the summer holidays. He was wearing the same outfit, a green hoodie and a surgical mask that he would wear to the Heartspace attack a week later. However, his father spotted him and pleaded with the taxi driver not to take him to his former school. After a discussion with his father, he returned to the house. Now let's talk briefly about the parents. We don't know too much about them. As we know, they fled Rwanda with their children. I did listen to a caller on the LBC radio station in England. Didn't really talk much about Axel, but more about the father. And it seems like the parents were, if not pillars of the community, known in the community. And this lady spoke very well of him. We've actually seen some text messages because Rudakubana it's quite bizarre, he was ordering weapons and getting them delivered to the house next door. Which leads to the question, the parents must have known. I mean, they knew that their son was disturbed and had some kind of violent tendencies because they'd reported him to the police. But apparently when the police raided the house after the attacks, they found weapons in the living room, or Axel had apparently been living in the living room. So is it possible at all that they didn't know about these weapons? Just on the parents as well, I want to again offer a slightly different angle. I mean, try and imagine how they would feel. I mean, I've never been a parent myself, but obviously my sisters have had children, and lots of people I know have had children. Try and put yourself in their shoes. How would it feel to see your innocent baby and child, as I said he was up to, let's say, age 12, descend to a point where they're almost inevitably going to erupt into some kind of violence. I think this was going to happen. And the problem is that you can't apprehend someone for a crime that you think they're about to commit, at some point in the future. So let's get on to the day itself, July 29th, 2024. I was watching this BBC Panorama documentary. I'll put it in the show notes. You could probably find it somewhere, especially if you have a BBC iPlayer. It's probably still there. And we actually have a taxi cam, the camera that's in the taxi. And you actually see Axel get in the taxi, and the taxi driver says, "Oh, how are you, lad?" or something like that. He's already booked the taxi with the address that he's going to, which is Hart Street in Southport. Now you look at this video and you say, does he look menacing? Some people said yes, but it's only really menacing in retrospect because you think about what he's about to do. It's so calm. I mean, it's almost just, it's surreal. Because the taxi driver is saying, "Oh, it's down there," and Axel says, "Oh, down there." And where is it exactly? And unfortunately for the taxi driver, he is directing him to the place where he's going to do a horrendous act. Anyway, they get to the end of the taxi ride. They arrive there, and Axel just walks out the taxi. The driver's saying, "Cash or card?" And in this Panorama program, they actually had more of it, because the horrific thing, like I said, for the taxi driver, not only is he taking him there, but his taxi cam, because he followed Rudakubana because he hadn't paid the fare. That's why we can actually see Rudakubana's movements from the taxi to going into the dance class. He got out at the wrong place. The taxi followed him and told whoever was there that he hadn't paid his fare. The other person said to him, "Pay your fare," and then you don't hear it, but you just see Rudakubana put his arm out and apparently said, "What are you going to do about it?" He just walks off. I can only describe the way he walks as he ambles. He's not running from the taxi in fear of the taxi driver, even though the taxi driver threatens to call the police, because obviously, he's got a knife in his pocket or under his top or whatever it is. But yeah, unfortunately, this taxi actually filmed him. He goes to the wrong door, and it's absolutely bizarre. I think you even see him knocking on the door, like, "Oh, can I come in?" That's the thing about this case. It's not only is it horrific, but it's absolutely bizarre. And then you see him go up the stairs to this, I think it was a yoga dance and a bracelet making workshop, which again is so horrendously, it's so horrendous in terms of how innocent that sounds. So you see him go up the stairs. You literally have video of him up to about 2 seconds before he carries out this attack. So this was a workshop themed around the music of Taylor Swift. The children were aged 6 to 11, all girls. And it was being held in the first whole week of the summer holidays. So if we go back just a week earlier, when his father had managed to persuade him to get out the taxi, or persuade the taxi driver not to take him, he was going back to his old school, and I think it was even the time of day was around the time that the school was going to finish. So he was going to clearly attack children as they were coming out of school. This is obviously the beginning of the summer holidays, a week later. And the other thing which makes it so chilling is that apparently he carried out this attack with no sound. There was no cries of a political cause. I'm not saying that would have made it any better or less horrendous, but I don't know. Is there some cold comfort, at least if you knew that he was doing it for some reason, even if it was a misguided reason? Now, in this BBC documentary, there's lots of testimony of the locals, and let me say, there's nothing humorous about this at all, but the only very slightly humorous part was that there was an older man, he probably looked about 60 on the video, and what happened was, after this thing started, obviously some children managed to escape out of this workshop, and the locals obviously heard what was going on, and this old boy basically in this documentary says, he went to get a hammer and he was going to sort this kid out. Now, of course, at the time he didn't know. And the only reason that I'm saying it's not humorous at all, but the only reason it just reminds me of, it's that the old-fashioned guy who's, doesn't need a gun or anything. He's going to, for all he knew, Axel could have had a gun. So a hammer's not going to do much good in that case, but it's that old-fashioned thing of, I'm going to go and sort him out. And of course, since Axel only had a knife, as opposed to a gun, this guy could have, but apparently, as he was about to do that, the police turned up pretty much at the same time. Right, I'm going to give you some slightly graphic details. It's going to be very brief, but I think we need to understand what Axel Rudakubana actually did. So as soon as he got up the stairs, he just went into the room without a word, grabbed the nearest child and started stabbing her. He had an 8-inch kitchen knife, and I've seen a picture of it. Some of you may have seen a picture. In the aftermath, a lot of people were blaming Amazon somehow, and believe me, I have no love for Amazon and some of their practices, but because he bought the knife from Amazon, it cost him about £2 or something. This is the graphic part. He killed 3 children. The youngest was called BB King, 6 years old, and he apparently stabbed her 122 times. Now, you could argue about how would they know it was exactly that number, but let's say over 100, 120, whatever number you want to go with, on a 6-year-old child, and 80 stab wounds on a 7-year-old child, and apparently he was stabbing them in the face. I don't want to think about that too much. There was also another thing in a video I watched, that there was some rumour that he may have even attempted to decapitate BB King. What do I know? But my instinct is that sounds like something on the internet where someone almost wants to one-up everyone else in terms of how graphic it is. I don't know, but if we just think about that for a second, even though we probably don't want to, if you stab someone 120 times, whether it's a child or an adult, clearly you've gone beyond the point where your motive is simply to kill them. You know, I mean, he had no axe to grind, as far as we know, with any of these children. He didn't know any of these children. So it's clearly just the most extreme and horrendous rage that's being enacted. The yoga teacher who was on this BBC programme said that she just felt that he wanted to kill everybody in that room before he left, or at least the children. He did attack some adults, mostly just because they were trying to apprehend him. And quite shocking here, I mean, one girl was pulled back inside and stabbed by Rudakubana while attempting to leave the building. She collapsed outside but survived. Now, we won't dwell on any more details, but basically the police arrived, I think it was about 12 minutes after he had arrived in the building. There's also a video of the police arriving, and one of the bystanders or people that got involved saying, you know, you need a gun, this guy's got a knife. They come with a taser. After backup arrived, an officer with a taser entered the studio, and there's a guy called Joel Verite, I don't know how you say his name, Verite. I'll put an interview with him because he was quite eloquent in the way he was describing it, and quite heroic as well. He didn't want to label himself a hero, but if there's any positive, and there isn't really, but the human spirit was definitely on show here. The way that people, especially when they knew that children were being stabbed, they risked their own life to try and apprehend this guy. The police came in, they encountered Rudakubana standing over BB King's body, that's a 6-year-old, still holding the knife. After being ordered to drop the knife, Rudakubana cooperated and was arrested by 2 officers, while I think his name might be Joel Verite, in fact, that's the way it's pronounced, carried King's body outside. There's also video of Rudakubana outside being cuffed by the police. Police actually are recording it themselves and put in the van. One thing which I found absolutely amazing was there's no blood on him at all. Surely if you've inflicted 200 stab wounds, you would expect to find some blood on him. But anyway, I don't know, he seems to be fairly meek at this point. It's almost as if his bloodlust has been satisfied and the reality, I don't know, might have set in. One of the versions of the murder of John Lennon, which, as I said, I have covered on my Glass Onion podcast, the killer seemed also to be in some kind of frenzy. I mean, he's given various accounts in the 40-odd years that he's been in prison. And I think he was somehow expecting to, in his warped way, to get some kind of closure from it. And all he found was that he'd destroyed someone's lives. And I just wonder if that's the case here. I mean, whether there's any thought in Rudakubana's mind. I mean, he's destroyed 3 lives completely. He's injured and traumatized others. And, of course, he's thrown his own life away. I mean, I know nobody cares now about his life, but he's still thrown his own life away. Now, almost immediately after this attack, there were a series of riots in the area. Of course, the media has to call it far right. They can't comment on anything without calling it left and right, even though those labels are fairly redundant, in my opinion, at this point. My friend Rob Ager, who's well known for film analysis on YouTube, he did a good video about how these riots were not just about this attack. They were about a repressed rage, really, in the country. I'll put that in the show notes. Now, Rudakubana wasn't blamed for those riots. Often you find that someone perpetrates an event and then everything that happens after that is also blamed on them. I mean, it doesn't really make much difference whether they're blamed on him or not. I mean, the level of hatred for what he's done is severe enough. Now, I just want to talk about police mugshots for a second. One of the things that the media were criticised for was that with Rudakubana, they were always, after he was named, because he wasn't named straight away, there was some rumour put round that he was a Muslim, and I believe a mosque was attacked in the riots. But yeah, there was some criticism because all we saw was this picture of this rather angelic. There were a couple of pictures that went around, one of him as an 11-year-old, smiling and looking quite angelic, and apparently he had been in the choir at school, so people were talking about him as a Welsh choir boy. But eventually we got this mugshot, and you must have seen this if you know anything about this case. This quite bizarre mugshot where, I don't know if I'd describe him as evil. He certainly looks a bit disturbed. It looks almost like a pose of evil, to be honest. And I think it serves a purpose because it cements, I think, for people who look at it, the idea that he's evil. And in our society, evil is not to be reasoned with or there's no attempt made to understand it. If someone is tagged as evil for perpetrating something as horrendous as this, then they're essentially written off as a human being. They become a monster. And nobody needs to reason with a monster. That's the way it is. Now, I want to pivot a little bit to Lucy Letby, really on the subject, starting off anyway with mugshots, because it's quite different with Lucy Letby, because there is that mugshot that is mostly used. Whenever you see a video or a newspaper report, particularly more mainstream ones that are talking about her guilt and presuming her guilt, since she was found guilty twice, that mugshot, I remember I was actually in Liverpool on a summer visit to see some friends when she was found guilty in 2023, the first time. And I saw this picture, and again, I hadn't really paid that much attention to the case. You put together someone being found guilty of murder or attempted murder of babies, and you see that picture, and it seems to make perfect sense. Now, of course, if you see any other picture of Lucy Letby, she just looks like a normal, fairly happy, smiling young lady, quite attractive. So I think in the case, mugshots can be quite effective. I mean, with the Moors murders in the 1960s, you didn't really need an evil mugshot because the details of those crimes were bad enough. But those mugshots of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are now seared into the consciousness. I think in the case of Ian Brady, I'm not going to go on tangent of that case because I've got enough to cover here, but in that case he probably was disturbed from the start, but Myra Hindley seems to have been seduced by him in every sense of the word. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the use of victims' families. Again, the massive difference, as I said at the top of the show, between Axel Rudakubana's crime and Lucy Letby's apparent crimes is the manner and I suppose some would say there was brutality in the way she killed these babies, if she did kill them, but there was no bloodshed and it wasn't a massacre. But in both cases, and in most cases like this, particularly involving children, which is considered the worst crime, I think paedophilia and child killing is probably considered worse than anything else almost. Perhaps terrorism, I suppose, mass killings. But I remember with Lucy Letby, on that day I arrived in Liverpool, I mean, it's a 4-hour drive from where I live. So I was listening to the radio, so obviously a lot of radio stories get repeated. And there were interviews with the families, and they were quite naturally saying, we're glad this monster, I don't know if those are the exact words, but we're glad that some justice has been served and, she'll be punished and everything. And there was anger, and of course, quite rightly. But I think let's just be honest, and this is something we have covered on the podcast before, the media needs a story, and unfortunately the more horrific stories tend to be the most absorbed by the public. So news outlets are, in a sense, giving the public what they want. I've debated this many times in conversations with people. It's a chicken and egg situation. Do the public ask for this, or are we so conditioned to be interested in these horrendous cases that they're just giving us what we want? I don't have the answer to that, but there's no doubt there's some stoking of hatred by the media, trying to get hatred from those directly involved, such as the parents of little children or babies that have been killed. Now, just sticking with Lucy Letby, I'll put a couple of things in the show notes. There's a podcast series called Was There Ever a Crime? And one of the presenters is a journalist who was involved in another high-profile miscarriage of justice. There's a YouTube channel called According to Carl in the UK. And I did want to talk about an interview I heard with a gentleman called Dowie Evans. I think that's how it's pronounced, Dewi, but it's pronounced Dowie. And he was the prosecution's quote-unquote star witness. And the guys that made this podcast series, they included an extract or a few minutes of their interview with him. But I listened to the whole thing. They posted it at a later date, about an hour it was. And some of the language, particularly considering what we now know, and I'm recording this in mid-March 2025, what is now believed might be the truth about Lucy Letby, he did admit that he spent 10 minutes looking over this case and decided that she was guilty. And on this podcast, he says something like, I don't understand why people are getting in a tiz. I think he even used that word. It's something like that. And you think about it, you're condemning a person, and if they're guilty, fair enough, but they might not be, there might be a reasonable doubt. You're condemning her to a life of hell. I mean, I don't know which prison she's in, but again, she's going to be a target because I'll get to this later, but prisoners tend to want to punch down, and she's going to be on the lowest rung. And this Dowie Evans, I mean, he doesn't seem to me to be a reliable witness. And partly through this interview, he talks about, it seems to be older white men who want to save Lucy Letby, and he compares it to trying to reason with Trump supporters. And I don't really see what the connection is there. I suppose in his mind, he's saying that you can't persuade people who don't want to be persuaded, but you could turn that back on him. Is there any weight of evidence that would persuade him that he's wrong? So I'll go through some more of the details. So there were 2 trials, as I mentioned, but there was only one defence witness that was called. And rather than go into it all now, I would recommend the podcast series. As of now, in March, I mean, we're at a stage where this could be the most famous miscarriage of justice of all time. People of a certain age in England will know about the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4. They were both in the 70s. I did hear, or I read, that there have been somewhere between 500 and 600 miscarriages of justice since the 70s. And the appeal system has a massive waiting list of cases. These are the kind of things that you never hear on mainstream media. Now, in the case of let's say a famous case like Lucy Letby, you could argue that the punishment is more severe, perhaps because it's more high profile. So should she be able to jump the queue of appeals, if you like? And going back to Mark David Chapman, who killed John Lennon, if he had killed a normal member of the public, he would have been out probably 20 years ago. I mean, he has been in jail for 44 years. Incidentally, John Hinckley, who shot President Reagan a few months after John Lennon was shot, he has been released. And I don't remember much of a fanfare about that. But yeah, essentially Chapman has earned himself a whole life order, not in name, by killing John Lennon. And with Lucy Letby, I personally think, here's my conspiracy theory, that the 14 whole life orders, the severity of that serves the purpose of cementing her guilt in the eyes of a lot of the public, because they think, how could they get it that wrong? Yeah, they get things wrong, but not that wrong. And really, my general feeling, at the time I didn't think much of it, but after she was convicted, I looked at it after the fact, which is something I'm sort of guilty of doing. I think the reason for these whole life orders might be to avoid even the possibility that the state killed those babies, not directly, but by underfunding the NHS. And also it could well be that the high-ranking doctors are not going to have their reputations tarnished by accusations. All I can say about that really is that the more powerful people in society do get preferential treatment. There's always a kicking downwards. In terms of public opinion, really it all comes down to how people receive information, which is something we have covered on this podcast. Do people have time to invest in studying cases closely, or do they just more or less believe what they're told? I was talking with a colleague at work, and we agreed that lawyers in a court are essentially salesmen. They are selling you their version of what happened. And they're using the evidence they have to tell a compelling story if they're good at their job. My colleague said he'd actually done jury service. We briefly referenced a famous film called 12 Angry Men. It's a fantastic film starring Henry Fonda, made in the 50s. And my friend was saying that he was actually called, as these things are quite random, called to jury duty. And it was a murder trial. So you have 12 jurors and you have to reach a unanimous verdict. And he said that after this prosecution, I almost said prosecution salesman, but there, let's go with that. Prosecution counsel, aka prosecution salesman, had so convinced them that when they got back to the jury room, basically my friend was in the Henry Fonda situation where the other 11 were all absolutely sure of the guilt, and he had to put his hand up, essentially to avoid someone being convicted without any discussion. Okay, the Southport attacks is a very extreme case because there's no way that he couldn't be guilty of what he's done. But my friend said that most of the people were so quick to believe this guilt, and based on what they were given and maybe prejudices, we all have prejudices. We'll see what happens with Lucy Letby, but in February, as a lot of you will know, there was a press conference where this so-called dream team, this panel of 14 international experts who were convened by a retired neonatologist who works in Canada, they ruled out murder in every case. They concluded that all the incidents could be explained by natural causes and or substandard care, finding no evidence of deliberate harm. So we'll see what happens with this. I think the news cycle makes everything old news eventually, unless it's constantly brought up. I suppose 9/11, things like that, stay in the public's memory. But how many people in England remember the 7/7 attacks, which are coming up for their 20th anniversary? That was like the English 9/11. But, we could be seeing a unique event fairly soon if she's retried and found not guilty. I mean, imagine a year from now, Lucy Letby back in society with an engraved apology from the state and probably a massive compensation payout. I'm not convinced that will happen, but you never know. Back to someone who definitely will not be returning to society, I don't think, ever. Axel Rudakubana. In December 2024, which is about 5 months after the attack, Rudakubana's not guilty pleas were entered on his behalf. During the video link with Liverpool Crown Court, he refused to speak. A 4-week trial was scheduled for January 2025. Now, of course, a not guilty plea sounds like the most absurd thing in the world in this case, and I can only think that the defence would have pled insanity or temporary insanity. Of course, you could say in a broad way, anyone who does what he did must be mad to some extent. However, I think there's two factors at play here, really. Not just in this case, but in a lot of these really heinous crimes. The public will not accept him receiving what they might consider a cushy number, which would be a mental hospital, basically, which is actually not a cushy number at all if you research it. I'll let you do your own research there. Also, the video shows him so clearly just calmly riding in a taxi and calmly talking to the driver. So on that level, it's very premeditated. He'd obviously researched that there was this class going on. By the way, the other thing I didn't mention was that, I mentioned it was a bracelet making workshop as well. They were actually making bracelets because it was near the end of the class when he came in. It just makes it all the more heartbreaking, just the absolute innocence of what they were doing just before the attack happened. But yeah, going back to that, so it seems very premeditated, but I think madness, insanity can be a bit deeper than that. It's below the surface. You can have premeditation on the surface, but it doesn't mean necessarily sanity. I will describe a bit later what will probably happen to him in terms of justice. So on the first day of the trial, he suddenly pleaded guilty. Now, I don't think anyone believes that he did that to spare the families. Maybe he was persuaded to do it by his defence counsel. Again, the more conspiratorial, possibly realistic view of it might be that perhaps he was spared a whole life order in return for pleading guilty. A lot of that happens, I can promise you. Deals happen of that kind. But of course, it conveniently means that they didn't have to hear, the families didn't have to hear the details of the case, although I believe some of it was actually told at his sentencing, but also didn't have to hear how the authorities knew about this guy for years and he slipped through the net. Not completely, but obviously he was free. I mentioned earlier, you can't apprehend someone for something that you think they're going to do, but basically they knew about him and it would have looked very bad for the authorities if that trial had happened. There was some other stuff said. Apparently after he was arrested, he was saying he was glad they were dead. And apparently during the sentencing, I think it was, rather than the quote-unquote trial that didn't actually happen, I think there was some audio played in the court of him saying he was glad they were dead. And some reporters were saying he was smirking in the court, although, there are pictures, there are drawings by an artist, and you don't see that. You see him covering his face with his head in his hands. One reporter said he behaved a bit like a petulant teenager who had his sweets taken away. It was something like that. But all this stuff about, he's smirking, he's really happy about it. Maybe it's true, but it just seems to be stoking anger further or portraying him as almost like a cartoon villain, of rubbing his hands and saying, I'm glad they're dead. Maybe he said it. Okay, if he said it, fine. Well, not fine, but I accept it. At the sentencing, a few days after the guilty plea, he was apparently shouting, it's not my fault, I'm ill. He was calling for a paramedic. Now, when he said, I'm ill, call me naive, but in a way I almost felt like he was saying, it's not my fault, I'm mentally ill. But if he's calling for a paramedic, he probably meant physically. He said he hadn't eaten for 10 days. Another thing that I think is a bit strange is that, like I say, the reporters were reporting on this, and then they said, he behaved disgracefully in the court. Let's just be realistic. The guy is fucked. He's got no life left. So why does he have to behave in the court? This is the thing I don't really understand. If you think about miscarriages of justice that have happened, and the judge with this stupid wig on, he's so high and mighty. And of course, he'll have some serious egg on his face if Lucy Letby is found not guilty and released. They're so high and mighty about all this. He didn't appear via video link for his re-sentencing, on some technicality. Why is it important that he turns up? Like I say, the guy has got nothing to lose. Now, there was also a question of the death penalty, and I don't think you can just bring the death penalty back for random cases, but I understand the argument that in this case it would probably be the best thing for everyone. I wonder, if Axel Rudakubana was offered the choice of, I don't know, he'd probably get a lethal injection. Some would say he should get the electric chair or something like that. Whether he would take that as opposed to spending 50 years in basically prison hell. I don't think he'll survive that long, honestly. But I suppose the argument is that could be the best thing for everyone. Because obviously the taxpayers are paying for him being sustained and his quote-unquote care. Just finally on this, in terms of what I know about his present situation, he's in a segregation unit in Belmarsh. He's under observation every minute of the day. They're obviously concerned that he might take his own life. He's there for his own protection, of course, but he's also probably being tested as much as you can possibly try to discover anything about why he did this. And the likelihood is that probably in about 3 years, perhaps when he turns 21, he might be transferred to the general prison population. Now, is he a danger to other prisoners? I highly doubt it. He did injure a couple of adults in the attack, but mostly that was just because they were stopping him attacking children. As I said, he'll never be released, and if he's moved to the general prison population in Belmarsh, he will be attacked at some point, what they call prison justice. There's a thing that is quite popular way of attack in prison because it's absolutely horrendous. It's what they call a napalm attack, and it's a mixture of hot water, presumably in a pan, with sugar or oil mixed in, and it causes horrific burns. I've never been in prison, nowhere near, but I've been watching and reading some stuff about it, and he'll be in constant terror of losing his life or being maimed. Wouldn't be surprised if it was a knife attack, an eye for an eye. And if you imagine the rage of prisoners generally, the amount of anger, they're locked up, there's no access to the opposite sex, for example. They might have had girlfriends, wives on the outside. But like I said with Lucy Letby, he's the absolute lowest rung of the ladder, and criminals often want to take the moral high ground, let's say, against paedophiles, child killers. They're perfect targets because nobody wants to feel that they are at the bottom of the pecking order of society. There's a race aspect as well. He's black. That could be mixed in. And one thing I know for sure that people will do, human behaviour can be explained only in as much as if people can justify it to themselves, they could do anything, basically. Now, I'm very hesitant to say this, but from my perspective, this will sound very weird, but, podcasts are a platform for honesty. This is not my career. Hopefully you appreciate the content and I get lots of nice messages, but it's also for me as well. I would never do this in a million years. I'm not going to go to Belmarsh and visit this guy. But if someone, let's say someone could transport me instantly to the visiting room at Belmarsh, I'll be perfectly honest, I would like to look in Axel Rudakubana's eyes and just see if there's anything there, if there's any trace of that boy from the BBC advert. Because as well as the attacks bothering me, among all the violent acts that happen in the world every day, the frustration is not knowing why. Now, another podcast series I did was on the art of happiness, which was a book that involved the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama spends a long period of his day meditating in general contemplation. And when asked if he could explain human behaviour, he just laughed at the idea of fully understanding it. We understand some things. But I think those who are interested should keep trying to understand as much as we can. And obviously, you find people in certain jobs. I mean, I'm a life coach. I'm not going to be dealing with someone who's done something like this. But life coaching has some similarities with counselling and therapy. And some people just have an instinct to, want to treat everyone like a human being while others are treating them like a monster. And I don't mean that, I promise, in a judgmental way. Just telling you my perspective. On that note, I should probably get out of here now. I hope you have enjoyed, if that's the right word, this podcast, or at least got something out of it. The next 2 episodes will be 2 parts of a conversation I did locally in my town in West Kent. And this will be back to the inner truth part of this podcast and very much lighter material, but hopefully will offer some inspiration in terms of different ways of viewing the world. So I'll be back for that. Probably part 1 will be next month and the next part in the following month. I've got a bit of a backlog. I've been recording podcasts like a demon. If you'd like to help me out with my podcast work across Life and Life Only, Glass Onion, on John Lennon and Film Gold, there are links in the show notes to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. You can make a one-off donation, don't need a subscription. If you don't want to do that, if you could just spread the word, share links, tell people about the podcast if you like the content. And on that note, thank you very much for listening and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.